dear listeners. John and I are very pleased to bring you today's conversation with Walt from the Black Casebook podcast. The Black Casebook, if you aren't familiar, is one of the best, if not the best, long-form Batman comic book art criticism podcasts. John and I are big fans, and we wanted to have Walt on to talk comic books, and he brought City of Glass. Illustrated by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli with involvement from Art Spiegelman, this graphic novel adaptation of the first of the New York Trilogy novels by Paul Auster is an inventive and absorbing postmodern detective story. It takes full advantage of its 9-panel grids to play around with notions of the dissolution of meaning, the porous nature of identity, and the signification of language. All pretty heady stuff from what is ostensibly a detective story. Needless to say, this is right up John and I's alley, and our conversation with Walt touches on a number of topics from postmodern fiction, detective stories as a genre, to the all-important question, what would Batman do in a situation like this? We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome back to the Infinite Library, ladies and gentlemen, and others. Ben and I are sitting down here today with a very special guest. We have Mr. Walt Lewellyn of the Black Casebooks. Walt, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hello, friends. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Walt, we asked you to come on the show about a month ago, and you picked out what we're reading today. We're talking about the adaptation of Paul Auster's City of Glass by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli. Hope I got those right.
Yeah, Mazzucchelli for sure. I don't know if it's Karasik like Jurassic Park or what, but I apologize in advance to him and his family.
Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with Walt's work, you do the internet's premier Batman art criticism podcast, I think it's fair to say.
I would say it's in the top 820 of those, probably. Yeah. I do. For those of you who don't know, the Black Casebook is my bizarre sort of vaguely literary criticism foray into discussing Batman comics and really just finding whatever resonates in the context of a given story, whether that's, say, looking at The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan movie, and looking at it in the context of the war in Iraq and the culture of the Bush era and how that sort of transitioned with the election of Barack Obama, which happened a few months after the movie came out. Things of that nature, just sort of looking at the deeper resonances in these things. The best I can say is that it is lit crit or political analysis or whatever adjacent. I am not a pro. This is my fun hobby I get to do.
Yeah, Ben and I really wanted to kind of expand the scope of the show just a little bit for our summer season. And so we really wanted to do a comic, and Ben showed me your show and I was like, let's see if he'll come on. So here we are.
Yeah, I want to say, well, I do think some of your stuff is the most like well-written content out there. Like the prose is just so good. And like I was saying off mic, I especially like, name drops of like Walter Benjamin and like Frederick Jameson. And I'm like, yeah, this is podcasting to me, is like getting able to like hear some nice connections. And like also real quick, yeah, your episode on Core of Owls made me like pick up Scott Snyder again. And I forgot that like, I think, didn't Scott Snyder write Black Mirror, the one about the like drug that turns people into like psychopaths in Batman? Or in Gotham City, rather. Yeah. And that was one of the stories that I picked up randomly and like read the entire thing in like a bookstore. So it was great, like hearing you talk about Scott Snyder and being able to like draw that connection for myself. It was very good.
Oh, he's great. Yeah. And I have a deep affection for that run still, warts and all. Great place to jump into the character if anyone is wondering, how would I start reading Batman? I'd say, honestly, another great place to jump in would be Year One. Which is by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, who is the artist on this. That's obviously where I know him best from, but it's a completely different thing than adapting this Paul Auster novel. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start talking a little bit about City of Glass? As much as we would love to talk Batman all day with the #1 Batman lit crit podcaster, you decided you wanted to talk about City of Glass. So just curious, if we kind of just want to, why did you decide this was the book you want to take down off the shelf and bring to the show, Walt?
Yeah, so we were talking about this ahead of time, but I first read this book in a 20th century American fiction class that was really heavily weighted towards more postmodern texts of the latter half of the 20th century. And so we read I guess it was called the New York novels, the trilogy that Auster did. But City of Glass was the one that really, really stuck with me. And, I just hung on to all these years. And I found out after starting my podcast that David Mazzucchelli, who of course is just a god to me. I mean, Year One is the best Batman comic. It's not a super novel opinion. And one of the unfortunate things about being a Batman fan is that I can't give like great deep cut recommendations. Like the stuff that everyone likes, you basically should go read that.
The canon, yeah.
Yeah. And like there are exceptions to that, but Year One is very much not one. It is the best Batman comic. I mean, it's everything you need to know about the character and why he works. And so much of that comes from David Mazzucchelli, who had previously partnered with Frank Miller, the writer and frequent artist, on Daredevil Born Again a couple of years earlier. Really outstanding story in its own right. But Year One is just full of such great energy. He excels so much at showing sort of the urban landscape that Batman operates in. His own Batman is very streamlined and it's just the perfect utilitarian design for that character. It fits exactly what the story needs. And so I've adored it forever. And finding out that he adapted City of Glass, I mean, obviously I had to check it out. And it's a totally different achievement, I would say. Mazzucchelli is, I know the Art Spiegelman is somehow like nebulously involved in putting together this project. Art Spiegelman, who did the graphic novel Mouse famously. And I think of this project and Mazzucchelli's work outside of Year One as being much more in line with what Spiegelman does, like a classic graphic novel. Nothing to do with superheroes, nothing to do with like big action or anything like that. It's all about a largely visual approach to storytelling. And I think that in a book that is so much about language and so much about the potential inadequacies of language, I think that Mazzucchelli's creativity in translating those concerns to the page, to a visual medium, really improves upon the original novel.
Yeah, I just to jump in slightly in the opening like 9-panel thing, there is a picture of a telephone and the voiceover text is the telephone's ringing, and then it zooms out to show that it's not a real telephone. It's the picture of the telephone in the phone book, and the actual telephone is sitting on top of the image. And I feel like just in that split, there's already stuff going on with the difference between like the sign and the signifier with language, and the idea of the book kind of being like a language detective story almost. And Mazzucchelli can do that in like essentially 3 frames, I feel like. I agree totally. I feel like he's very good at translating like the more idea parts of the book into like a visual like medium that's like, immediately like transparent.
Yeah, and visceral. Yeah.
Again,
I don't want to jump into the plot necessarily yet, but the main character of the book, Dan Quinn, is that Daniel Quinn?
Quinn, yeah.
His prior to the narrative starting, his wife and child died. I don't think we know how or why, but that was like 5 years ago, and he's still clearly grieving and has not moved on really. In fact, he's retreated from the world. And obviously the same is true in the original Auster novel, but the difference in how Mazzucchelli can depict this is that whenever Quinn's child, Peter, is mentioned, there's just this like crayon drawing. It clearly was something done by Peter of like, it looks like a screaming child.
Yeah.
And it is heart-wrenching and upsetting every single time. And it's just, it doesn't draw attention to itself. It's a very subtly deployed thing, and it's only a few times throughout the whole graphic novel. But every single time, it just hits you right in the gut. And that is, again, that's just one of those things that a comic can do that a prose novel cannot exactly.
Or, for me, the moment that really struck me in kind of that first couple pages, it's when the phone rings for the first time and he's staring at it naked. And then he imagines his detective character, who is drawn, more cartoonishly even than he is, with kind of these very sharp angled features and deeper shadows, just appears there and is answering the phone and kind of not even interacting with him, but just there doing what he thinks maybe he should do. Mm-hmm. And what I find so impressive with this is it's all just black and white. There's no, everything here is just done with black ink on white paper. And that's always so amazing to me.
Yeah, especially in what is a noir story. Like operating that high contrast, like heavily German expressionist influence, especially as sort of the plot breaks down later on and things become more abstract. Mazzucchelli just does an incredible job of leaning into that sort of noir iconography for all that it's worth. I mean, at one point, I know that Quinn has run into, like, we probably need to get to the plot at some point, but basically he's trying to solve a case. He's not qualified to solve a case. The case might not actually exist. It's all, nebulous. And he seems to be descending into a fantasy. And at one point he goes to a payphone to call his nominal client, and half of his body is outside the payphone box, and it's just depicted as normal. And then the half that's inside, the half that's actually his head and the phone next to his ear, is in complete shadow. Like that, and he's in noir zone in that box. And it just shows you, again, it's just great visual storytelling, trying to efficiently depict what Auster depicts at length, and what is a very spare and minimalist novel, but still trying to convey that same thing in fewer pages and very little real estate.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning too, just to talk about Auster's book briefly, is that like he's usually associated sort of like with American postmodernism, like you had said, you'd read him in that class. But it was my impression that like he was actually bigger in Europe, because the Europeans like their postmodernists to be like a little less like insane. So like, Umberto Eco and like Paul Auster, like the prose is minimal, but he obviously gets a lot of mileage out of what he's doing. And in some ways he compares it to like, Daniel Quinn talks about how in a detective novel, like nothing is wasted. Everything has potential for meaning. And I think Auster tries to do that in City of Glass. And then, this is kind of contrasted with like American postmodernists, like William Gaddis or John Barth or Robert Coover, where there's a lot of fireworks. There's a lot of like experimentation. It gets like a little flashy, which, I like both, but that's something I like when I was kind of looking up Auster, like I didn't realize. And speaking of which, like he did pass away this year. So this ended up being kind of like a timely episode topic to talk about Auster and about like this, graphic novel adaptation. And he's somebody that also so I had a roommate in my master's who was an MFA, and he was a big Paul Auster guy. And so like, it was nice. I had read City of Glass, and like, I think it kind of just went, I think I didn't pay enough attention to it because I like the flashy guys, but rereading it this time, I enjoyed it quite a bit. And I think like there's a lot that Auster can do with his style that I think, other people like. It's so minimal and every word is doing like a lot of work. And I think that's pretty cool. And I also think too that Mazzucchelli gets a lot of the same like worth out of multiple kinds of images, like he does, with the diagram of the child and like, or the drawing and like other stuff as well.
On the topic of Auster, I mean, the another very postmodern touch in this book is he's in it. Right. Character. I know we keep circling around the plot, but just while we're on the topic of Auster, he does kind of one of those very classic postmodern things of putting himself in the book in a very direct way that I again, I definitely want to go and read the novel after reading this, because I found the narrative intriguing enough that I think, yeah, like kind of going in reverse to how you guys have gone novel to or comic to novel, I think will be an interesting experience. So yeah. Well, do we want to talk about the plot a little bit? I feel like
yeah, we've been waiting in. Let's do it. Yeah.
All right.
So.
Yeah. Who wants to do it?
I can. Well, I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
Okay. So to sort of not get too into the weeds immediately, City of Glass opens with the story of Daniel Quinn, who had been married and had a 3-year-old kid who both died. And as Walt had mentioned, we don't know why. And he had been an author, but he probably after he lost his wife and child, he just started writing detective novels, Max work novels under the pseudonym. What is the pseudonym? William Wilson. Right. Yeah. So the pseudonym of William Wilson. And so then he gets a call suddenly in the middle of the night. And the person is asking to speak to Paul Auster, the detective. And he sort of refuses to answer the phone. And as John mentioned later, he sort of imagines what Max Work would do, who would answer something like in the noir, like, yeah, who's asking? And so he calls back and he says, I'm Paul Auster. And he gets a case essentially to go downtown and meet a Virginia Stillman, who wants him to meet a one Peter Stillman. And now Peter Stillman is, I can't remember his age, but at some point he was intensely psychologically affected by being locked in a room for 5 years, something like that. And anytime he would speak,
9 years. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So more so. And anytime he would speak, his father would hit him because of some reasons we can get into later. And so as a result, he's kind of psychologically affected, and he speaks at length to Daniel Quinn in this very broken monologue, at which point Virginia Stillman comes back and says his father, who kept him in the room, is sent him a letter that said he was going to kill him. And so Daniel Quinn is tasked with watching out for the father, who's taking a train into New York, and notifying Virginia Stillman of his presence so that they can be aware if they try to kill Peter Stillman. And that's, I think, most of the inciting incidents, unless I've forgotten something crucial.
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it. Yeah,
we're in the action at that point.
Yeah.
Would you guys say that he's a good detective? What's y'all's thoughts on his process?
I mean, it's interesting. I think that framing him as a writer of detective fiction, I don't know if people who actually write detective fiction make good detectives, but at the very least, it made it. I didn't feel taken out of it the same way I would if it was just some random schmo, just deciding to act like a detective. But I mean, he manages to track down the father pretty quickly after this inciting incident. Which,
although he does
like more than I could do.
Yeah, there's that moment of like almost absolute terror when he sees like what he thinks is two separate versions of Peter's father at the train station when he's supposed to follow him, and then he picks one and then immediately decides to pick the other one. And so there's like and it like illustrates him like making a complete 180, like the way Mazzucchelli depicts it. And so like I feel like that was something that I would do, being like somebody who's pretending to be a detective. So I feel like I would do about the same job, which is to say, like, I don't know if he's a good one, but he would do what I would do, I guess, in terms of like panicking.
He's certainly very diligent, I would say. Perhaps too diligent, as it turns out. But that's such a good example of what detective work is like for him, because he's pretending. He's stepping into the persona of Paul Auster, who is the detective that they asked for when they called the mysterious Stillmans. They say like, well, Paul Auster's the detective we need to solve this and protect us from murder and death. And so he's like, okay, I'll be Paul Auster. I'll do that. And just tries to go based on the world around him, based on context clues, based on his assumptions from his work as a detective writer, and is constantly sort of confronted with the inadequacies of that. And so that's such a good example where like he has a photo of the guy from when he was younger, the Peter Stillman Sr., the person he's supposed to be tracking, who's the alleged threat. So it's, he's got to already extrapolate from a photo that no longer applies. And then he sees what he thinks is Stillman Sr. and then sees the exact same guy. Basically has to pick, like, do I pick the version of this guy who's hunched and seems kind of harmless and elderly, or do I pick the one who's like a sophisticated, wealthy looking guy, which his understanding is that this is a rich man, or was. And so he's just got to guess. And constantly it's, to what degree are the guesses I make, to what degree do the guesses I make, like, suffice as a load-bearing structure for meaning? How often, if I follow this trail, will my idea of a narrative coalescing, of answers coming my way, how often will that actually persist before it completely falls apart? And that the sort of the brilliance of it, in the way that Mazzucchelli depicts it, especially, is showing how easily those threads can be lost, and how easily language can be rendered insufficient to find any kind of meaning. Because as we find out later in a very meaningful conversation, when Quinn finally speaks to Stillman Sr., the world is broken. We live in the land of Babel, and because of the fall from grace, from perfect understanding, echoing very much the philosophy of a guy named John Battista Vico, we live in a scattered and impossible to understand world. And how do we rebuild it? How do we rebuild the kingdom of heaven, through language? People venture various guesses, and I don't think anyone quite gets there. But that to me is like, that's the real postmodern element of the book. Even where like Paul Auster is showing up, that's just yet another example of, well, your assumptions are just not going to hold water here. They can't withstand this amount of reality. And how does your brain compensate as these failures accumulate? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and also there's a big theme of, like, once you start putting together these like stories about your case or about the person you're following, you eventually just become that person, or you get like so close that you are becoming that person. And there's a line from Ghosts, which is the second one in the trilogy, that I just wanted to read real quick because I feel like it kind of captures what you were saying. So in terms of is this just like a line that you don't really need the context for it in Ghosts? Because like in Ghosts, one guy is watching another guy and he starts becoming that person. And so he says, if thinking is perhaps too strong a word at this point, a slightly more modest term, speculation, for example, would not be far from the mark. To speculate, from the Latin speculatus, meaning to spy out, to observe, and linked to the word speculum, meaning mirror or looking glass. For in spying out at black across the street, it is though blue were looking into a mirror, and instead of merely watching another, he finds that he is also watching himself. So yeah, there's kind of like the moment where it, like, you're becoming this person, you're getting very close, your stories are trying to match reality, but there's always something that sort of doesn't quite work that causes it to like fall apart, or it needs like further adjustment. And so like when he starts following Peter Stillman Sr., Boston Stillman, from the airport, like at one point, or not the airport, from the train station, at one point he's just like, yeah, like I'm inside this guy's skin, like I'm wearing it like a coat, and like he thought he was doing that, but then, due to some unexplained stuff, like he loses him, and then it's sort of like the typical like detective. There's always that moment in the detective story where like it's like the detective is at like a down point. I don't know what the exact word for it is, but it's like, oh, like I got taken off the case, or like I lost my man, or like there's always like some
your second act trauma, second act obstacle that has to be overcome.
Yeah, somebody steps in, and so like, yeah, he loses Boston at one point. We're like, we don't have to talk about what happens after that, but yeah, like there's a moment where like he ends up becoming kind of like Peter Stillman Sr. In terms of observing him so closely and like constructing this story out of what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, were you going to say something?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say I think identity is a really interesting theme in the novel. I think we're kind of touching on that. And I think with the figure of Sellers Sr., the father, I found his kind of story really fascinating. He, I don't think we've touched on kind of yet his whole deal. He was per what Daniel Quinn is told by Peter Stiller's wife, Virginia. His father was this famous academic who studied these obscure Puritan era texts by this preacher named John Dark, who was the secretary of Milton of Paradise Lost fame. And this guy, after Milton died, immigrated to America and extrapolated this whole theory of language and the fallen nature of language, and how if we could rediscover the original like Adamic tongue, what the language that was spoken in the garden, when meaning and word were one and the same thing, that we could regain like that state of innocence, more or less. And then over the course of the novel, we find out that this is why he did this to his son, Peter. He was trying to basically keep him from learning a normal language so that he could recover this heavenly language, which, he theorized was like instinctual on some level to humans without kind of the interposition of culture on them. And then we also find out a little later that John Dark, the preacher who postulated this theory in the 1600s, doesn't exist. He was a complete invention of Sellers Sr. to propagate this theory within the realm of academia, I guess.
Well, he also says to say things that like might be too dangerous for him to say. And so he puts them in Dark's mouth. Yeah.
Which is really interesting. I mean, I don't know if that would have worked in academia in the 60s, but I feel like if somebody said, I found all these books by the secret secretary of Milton, I feel like people would be a little more skeptical today.
And by the way, I agree with everything he says. Isn't that weird? Yeah. What a coincidence. But authorship. It's a question of authorship kind of all the way down. Like it is, our main character, our protagonist is an author. He is, he's multiple of his selves. He refers very on to a triad of selves. You have Daniel Quinn, the real guy, quote unquote, William Wilson, his persona that he assumes when he's writing these detective novels, and then the protagonist of those novels, Max Wirt, who's like a two-fisted tough guy, private eye. And then he becomes Paul Auster, who in his mind is a detective, but who we know is a writer, as he tries to discover the truth of this mystery. And continually, whether it's a breakdown of language into smaller and smaller and less relevant parts, or if it's the relocation of who's saying or writing that language, always meaning is fleeting, and the more you shine a light in one area, the more it flees to the shadows, and there's no way of discerning it. And the harder he tries, the further away it gets, again and again. Have you guys read the story William Wilson? I
was just about to ask that. I have, yeah.
So when he refers to a triad of selves, I can't help but think of it. This is probably way too pat, but I think of it as like maybe a Freudian analog, possibly. Yeah. Your classic, psychological or philosophical triad that people love to work in. So the ego very clearly being Daniel Quinn himself, this sort of automaton who goes about being ventriloquized by a force that he doesn't really understand. Then you would have William Wilson, who is sort of a very distant superego. The superego in Freudian terms is not just your conscience, but very much like your social obligations, a sense of norms and normality, that which enforces that inside of yourself, like the nun wrapping you with a ruler every time you step out of line.
Or the thing Zizek says about the superego commands you to enjoy things. Like you will enjoy this or something like this is what you should enjoy. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But the superego has fallen largely silent since the great tragedy that befell Quinn, right? He exists only in the form of William Wilson, and the story of William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe, it's a doppelganger story, as many Gothic stories are, as many Poe stories are, and he, unlike the normal stories, though, the protagonist of William Wilson is kind of shit-heel, ne'er-do-well, and every time he tries to get away with something bad, this doppelganger, William Wilson, will show up and prevent it from happening. And at the very end, spoilers for like a 6-page long story or whatever it is, but he shoots William Wilson. He's like, I've had it with this fucking William Wilson. Get him out of here. And he realizes that he's bleeding and that William Wilson has been his conscience the whole time. William Wilson is his superego in that frame. So again, maybe that's too pat, but to extend the analogy, Mac's work is sort of a distant id. Also, like assuming that all these things have been sapped of their vitality by grief, and by a distance from yourself that's created by depression, by despair, then they'll only visit in these sort of quarantined ways, where William Wilson, your superego, visits as, let's say, a narrator, which is perhaps who the narrator is of the whole story in City of Glass, is William Wilson. Or a possibility anyway, or maybe that's just the function that narrative captions serve as created in a comic book, is that's the superego talking. The people that we see acting out, well, Daniel Quinn, that's the ego speaking and engaging in everyday life, pursuing objects, but being repulsed by the abject. That makes sense as well. And then your id, as you don't see it a lot. It's not like a prurient book at all. But at one point, he's living this fantasy. He thinks I'll be a detective. And so what does a detective do? They meet with a femme fatale. And the younger Stillman's wife, Virginia, who we only meet once or twice, is presented very much in your classic femme fatale way. In the book, it's mentioned she's wearing a black dress and bright red lipstick. And she, kisses Quinn and says, like, just to let you know, like, there's more where that came from, basically.
Right.
Very, very Evangelion style.
Also, there's the moment when he's interviewing her, and it's like, again, it's one of these moments where the power of the visual storytelling really takes over. And he's looking at her, and she's clothed in one panel, and then she says something, and the next panel she's nude, and clearly like he's imagining this because at least in as I'm reading it, and I think this is very much in line with how you're reading it, Walt, like him trying to step into this detective persona is him kind of trying to get back in touch with these parts of himself that he's become so distant from in this grief. So this, really seems like this is the first time he's been horny since his wife died. Because he's inhabiting this more vital like archetype, not to go from Freud to Jung, but
we all do it.
There.
We all have to do it sometimes. But no, absolutely. Yeah. It's a very simplistic form of meaning, but that's what the id is there for, in part, is to impart, just a sense of purpose, even if that's pure libidinal pleasure and satisfaction. This guy has not had for 5 years, again, because he's just completely paralyzed by grief.
And all he can do is work, which I think is the William Wilson, the superego. Like all it can do is like get him to just function in like capitalism, which he's at least a little lucky in that he can make a living writing mystery novels, which is a little harder to do these days.
It's a period piece for sure.
And I thought that was interesting too, that like the press of this neon literature was like an Avon imprint, and Avon only does mass market romances and like detective stories. So there was an interesting kind of like resonance there, that it was like this like this graphic novel adaptation of a story about a detective writer is published by like a detective mass market thing. And so I thought there was like a cool resonance there. And like apparently they had planned 3 things and they got the second one done, but then Avon got bought by like a bigger corporation, and the third one ended up getting put out by like I think Fantagraphics or something. So like they didn't even complete their initial like 3-book Neon literature run. But yeah, I just thought the connection to like an actual detective mass market publication house was interesting.
No, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and that's just it's dissipating meaning all the way down. That's best intentions all the way down.
Well, we talked about Virginia a little bit. Do we want to talk about the Sellers a little bit more as a couple? Because I think they're really interesting characters. And I think we're as we keep going, a lot of the ambiguities and the really kind of strange parts of the story really come in.
You mean like the Stillmans, right?
Yes. Did I not say the Stillmans?
I thought you said Sellers, but I might have misheard you.
But
I might have, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk about the Stillmans for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that initial monologue where Peter comes into the room and he is like this ghost, basically. Yes. He's dressed, as far as we can tell, again, given the way the book is drawn, he's all in white. There's no black touches on him aside from his belt, basically, which I think is mostly just an incidental detail. But he's white. He seems, I can't even exactly figure out how he's walking. He's drawn in such a way where you can tell he's like, walking weird. Yeah, you can't actually determine.
He's in the Black Lodge. Yeah,
yeah.
And like it's very Lynchian the way that he moves. And again, Mazzucchelli is just the best to ever do it, I think. And because I reread this passage before I talk earlier today, because I wanted to know, like, is this as weird in the book? And yes, it is. It talks about like he is a puppet being ventriloquized. He does not move under his own power, and only with like great struggle, great effort. And that's exactly what we see in a as I recall, textless page. It's just him trying to sit down in the chair.
And he does it like he's like, there's like a panel of him like lowering himself awkwardly like into the chair.
Yeah.
And then he just immediately starts speaking. And it's this great image of the classic comic book speech bubble. But rather than kind of the way you usually see it, where it's just kind of, you have the little tail that's kind of gestured towards the person's mouth. This is emerging like smoke or like a serpent, like out of his throat and his open mouth. And, whatever's speaking here is not him. It's a thing that is inside him and is speaking out into the world.
Yeah, he's possessed by speech. It is like one of the things that's being referred to with Stillman Sr. and his like great plan to create this, Adamic, pre-Lapsarian language is the language of Enoch. Do you guys know about like John Dee and
yes.
Elizabethan court and all that shit? But yeah, he was a statesman among other things, but he was sort of like the personal astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, and really believed, was one of the big names in like the esoteric tradition in Western philosophy, or Western magic, I should say. But yeah, he believed that we could get to, again, this like primal pre-Lapsarian language, a language of angels, language of Enoch, who famously among the church the early prophets is the one who doesn't die. He ascends into heaven. And like he walked with God, I think is the way that it's put.
Yeah, he becomes the angel Metatron.
Yeah. And so like that's sort of what they're trying to achieve. But anyway, in trying to create an Enoch through violence and deprivation, Stillman Sr. has created this empty vessel who is possessed by language, as if he were possessed by an angel or a demon. You see it referenced later on, but there's when Paul Auster becomes a character in the book, not merely a persona that Quinn wears. He goes to visit him at his apartment, and on his buzzer, you see a list of names, and one of the names, and I think this is purely a Mazzucchelli thing that he worked into this. but one of the names on it is K. Hauser. And so Casper Hauser, who was a real life, like human cryptid, basically, who, I believe in maybe the 1700s, 1800s, just showed up out of nowhere in this German town and could only speak like 3 phrases, one of which was, "I want to be a cavalryman like my father was before me." And other than that, he could just say, "Don't know." Now, those are the 2 things he could tell you at any given time. And no one had any idea what the fuck to do with them. And he was just this strange feral child. But there have been many theories ventured as to, what was going on with Casper Hauser. And this is one of them. That he was raised in deprivation, that his, overbearing father trained him to say this one thing, essentially. Again, this empty vessel filled sporadically and without meaning by language.
Which, again, I think is really interesting in the context of the Freudian reading we were doing. This is a guy who is not just like detached from, his superego and his id are not just distant from him. Like they are practically like separate entities at this point. Like he is, I think the implication, I think the implication is that this could happen to anyone if they kind of if they're deprived of meaningful contact with the world for too long. There's
and also like
very odd like implications about like Peter's sexual habits.
Oh yeah, I was just about to say that. Like, yeah, he I guess has sex with prostitutes that Virginia gets for him. He does not have sex with Virginia, who is his wife and was originally his language teacher. And then they cut from the phrase they didn't use the phrase from the book where Peter says about the prostitutes, "I put my worm inside them," which is like a nice bit of kind of like gross phrasing that they probably wisely decided not to put in the graphic novel. But I noted that as just like, yeah, maybe there wasn't room for it, but he's definitely got something going on with his like sexual habits.
Yeah. He's just, civilization doesn't mean anything to him. Like niceties, social niceties do not exist in any way except just they're almost, as is the case in lots of elements of this adaptation, it's a structuring absence. It's something that like, it's only because it's not there that he's like, oh, I'm doing something wrong. It exists in negative, basically. Yeah. But yeah, it's very upsetting because he mentions, like my Virginia will procure young women for me to fuck, is specifically what he says. And she does it because Virginia doesn't fuck. And it's so nasty, right? Like it presented in really like unpleasant terms. And it's just, you're talking to somebody who has no grasp of politesse or etiquette at all. And why would he? Because he's theoretically accessing something more honest. He even says that my name is not Peter Stillman.
Yeah.
And I think he's being honest when he says that. Like, he is Peter Stillman Jr., like that is the truth. But in his mind, being raised again in total isolation, like Casper Hauser, his name is something that we can't pronounce, something we can't access. This Enochian perfect God name. And it's beyond us. And he just exists as this like in this strange half world. Again, it's very Black Lodge. It's very like, I am trying to speak to you in a language you will understand, but I'm speaking in reverse,
Yeah. There's also a cool parallel between where he talks about like speech is saying a word and then the word immediately dies and sort of is gone. And that is paralleled when Daniel Quinn actually starts following the father Boston around. He's like walking through the city and picking up objects, but he later realizes that his steps are tracing out words. And at one point, like the Daniel Quinn like immediately goes like, well, it's like you're saying something and then it just goes away, which is exactly what like Peter says about speech itself. So the idea that like, yeah, if you make a mark or something, like the mark can easily just, it's not substantial. It doesn't stay, it just immediately disappears. And it has no like solidity for too long, at least.
Yeah. I mean, there's this sense of, I don't want to take it back as I always do to the Kabbalah, which is if anyone's listened to my podcast, it's a recurring thing that comes up, but it's a really helpful to me anyway, conceptual way of looking at things. that I think is being referenced in sort of a subtle way in this, or certainly a key concept of it is, which is that the world is broken. The world is broken and needs to be mended, and it's up to us to mend it. Like Stillman Sr. basically says that exactly.
Yeah.
And in his mind, that can be done through these load-bearing terms of language, through a perfect language. We will recreate a fallen world. And so there's like a sense of pressure being put on it. And obviously, like the incredibly abusive, beyond abusive circumstances of how he raised his son are applying that same pressure. You would only do that, sans just being a madman, if you really thought this will save the cosmos, you know? And so words can't just exist on their own. Things can't exist contextually. They have to serve a bigger purpose. There has to be some greater meaning that we're working towards. It can't just be this. That's sort of the underlying thing, because Quinn has been living in just this, just a place just devoid totally, like Margate Sands in the Wasteland, totally devoid of meaning. And so how else could he get wrapped up in this besides a quest for meaning making? Essentially, that is constantly foiled because that's not the way to do it, you know. And also, he's a character in a book, as he sort of like broadly discovers, I think.
Yeah, what did you guys think of the bit where Paul Auster gives his Don Quixote theory? And like the theory is that like Don Quixote, or the Arabic translator, is also Don Quixote. I was getting a little confused with the theory because like something involving like Sancho Panza couldn't have written the book because he's very verbal, but he can't write. So it's clearly like that either Don Quixote wrote the book himself or someone else did. Anyway, it sounds like he gives this theory to like justify the fact that Paul Auster is meeting one of his own characters. It's like mirrored in Don Quixote, but it was like a really interesting take on Don Quixote that Daniel Quinn thinks is really stupid because like there's like he doesn't have any answers for him on the case that he's on. He's like, why am I listening to this guy? Like this guy can't help me at all. But like the theory of Don Quixote was like, I couldn't tell if that was like Auster being like, here's what I like, Auster, the actual author, thinking about like, here's what I think about Don Quixote, or he's like having it mirror what's happening in the like detective story itself.
I think it's a mirror. I don't think like I kind of get bothered by some meta attempts and some postmodern things where I think it's, you know, a little too cute by half sometimes. Yeah. In this case, I think it is really an extension of a thematic, like, you're looking for a meaning in a certain place. You're looking for like, there's a great author, whether that's of a specific work of fiction or poem or whatever, or whether it's God, you know, or Adam, you know, to the origin of the naming of things that will give some guidelines here. And that author keeps moving. We don't know who the author is. In the case of the Quixote, you know, another one of Paul Auster, the character's neighbors, is P. Menard. So Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. The Borges story, which again, all about authorship. Like in that story, Pierre Menard rewrites the Quixote, Don Quixote, word by word. And it's like, well, I'm the author of it now. Well, I don't understand what the issue is. I wrote it. It's there.
And the narrator is like, this guy's is so much better. This Pierre Menard's Don Quixote is so much better than the other one. Like,
again, it's what can and can't be load bearing. What pressure do you put on these things? And so I think in this case, what really basically Quinn, as we've sort of established, is not doing great at the beginning of the story. He's not doing great throughout the story. And he experiences like this full on psychotic break. Yeah. Right around the time that he has this exact conversation about authorship. And specifically, what Auster ends up saying to him is that, you know, he says, how many games like this will people tolerate? How many blasphemies and lies and things like that will people tolerate just to be amused? And he says they'll tolerate it endlessly because they only read to be amused. In other words, they don't read for meaning. They don't read to grow or to find something internally true. They read it to pass the time. And that troubles the character of Quinn so deeply in the same way that when he saw somebody reading a William Wilson novel at the subway waiting to trail Boston Stillman, she's like, well, I don't know. It's like, I'm killing time. You know, like it's like there's better books, there's worse books. I don't give a shit. you know,
again, it's a period piece. People reading.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. There's no like lovers to enemies tropes list that you're trying to follow in terms of what you will and won't buy. You know, it's not a comic book, but
well, that also fits too. Like I feel like a lot of postmodern scholarship is really into play. It's like this thing that you do if you can't get any like final signifier. And so like, you know, Derrida talking about the play of discourses, like leading to difference. It's like this constantly shifting meaning. And so like that's a very like to me like a play reading as like this generative thing. If you can't get like, the final true thing or like the final signified or something like that. Yeah,
totally. And to you know, skip to just the very end, one line at the end. The narrator, who again is never revealed, I think is William Wilson, at the end says, I think that Auster behaved badly throughout the whole affair, and we're not friends anymore. And I think that's a reference to, I mean, Auster's obviously like having fun here, but I think it's also a reference to Auster being like, look, they're just words on a page, man. Like, it doesn't matter that much. Like, obviously, on the one hand, it's incredibly important to me and it's my craft that I'm pursuing. And like, these are important questions to ask. But on the other, like, this is a game. I'm playing a game here. And if you're a character in that game, well, maybe it doesn't feel that way, does it? You know, like it all takes on a deeper charge. But it's, I think, actually, to come back to Stillman Jr., one of the other thing that Auster, the character, says that is so troubling to Quinn, or it's not even something he says, it's just his son comes home after playing with a yo-yo outside or whatever the incident is. But he comes, he speaks to Quinn, who the son looks exactly like his son did. Is like, we get that sense anyway. The Auster son is named Daniel, and the son, in kind of like kid babble, even says like, everyone's Daniel, it's all Daniel, and
goodbye me,
goodbye me, yes, exactly. And it like this like precipitates the full breakdown, not just that sense of like dislocation of identity, but just being confronted again with this horrible abject thing, which is the death of your child that you can never persevere through and forget. It's like eternally real and present with you. That, not to just keep rambling and monologuing on, but I'll just say briefly again, I think a comic book can do in sort of a unique way compared to prose fiction is think about time as a constructed thing, time as something that we perceive, but that is not necessarily real, the passing of time, I should say. And so you can put things from two different chronological moments side by side, and they're both, as far as us as readers are concerned, equally present, equally real. And so in this case, as Mazzucchelli does a few times, deliberately deploying that image of the crayon child, that says everything we need to know about what Quinn is averting his eyes from and trying not to engage with. And what he, again, is confronted with in this moment, and everything else falls apart after that. But bring it back, Stillman Jr. Also reminds him of his son, and also makes him wonder, my son is in a dark place that is possibly close to God, but I don't know. It's in it. I didn't plan this, but in a sense, I am doing what Stillman Sr. did. Or in my imagination, that's one way perhaps that my son's afterlife is playing out. And his continual identification with Stillman Sr. ends up being like the precipitating thing that causes him to lose his mind.
Yeah. Because he ends up, like, as I said, like following him around and then tracing his movements and then realizing that he's spelling out like in semaphore or something like the Tower of Babel. And then he's just like, what am I doing? he's like, am I losing it? Kind of like, as well as with the stuff that you had said.
He's like, am I losing it? But he doesn't stop. He keeps doing it. He keeps following him. He can't put down the thread once he's picked it up.
Well, this is what brings him to Auster, is that he's kind of like, I don't know what to do here. I can't figure this out. Let me go find the real Paul Auster, the detective. And then he goes, and it's just some writer.
Just some guy. And he's like nice.
I think he's like honestly a little too nice, maybe. But I guess there's this implication that Auster, he doesn't know Daniel, but he's familiar with his previous work as a poet.
Yeah.
And so he kind of thinks of this as like, oh, this is kind of a colleague. Like this is someone who I've heard of. So he feels this level of like safety in terms of like, oh, this is like a guy I can chat with about this. He doesn't know he's talking to like someone who is on the verge of an absolute psychotic breakdown at this point.
Right. But I do think he gets a sense of like, the way he puts it is like, oh yeah, I used to read your poetry. I really enjoyed your book or whatever. And this was years ago. And the unspoken thing there is like, well, why'd you stop? And I think he does get a real sense of there's something profoundly wrong and troubled with this guy, Quinn. And if I look at him as a human being and don't let him just like fade into the wall, maybe I can prevent something worse from happening. Like, why don't you stay for dinner? And Quinn just can't accept it, can't open himself up to that, which, again, ironically would lead to an influx of meaning and purpose, perhaps beyond this fantasy that he's sort of indulging in. But it's too painful. It's too much. Like the whale in Avatar 2. It hurts too much to talk about.
Well, and too, like the way, because in the book it's like he feels self-conscious because Paul Auster has a wife and a kid, and he's like, he feels like Paul Auster is mocking him with everything he's lost. But then the guy who drew it depicts it as him being like stabbed through the stomach with like a giant spear, and he's just like bent over bleeding at the sight of like Paul Auster's like perfect family, and then he's just like, I can't stay. Like this is too painful. Yeah,
exactly. It's such a good like little subjective representation. He's like as dying as anyone has ever been, basically, being gutted by this emotion. And I guess on the Mazzucchelli tip, it's also worth noting, like, as we're looking at language, as we're looking at sort of the way that the meaning of words dissipates, that speech from Stillman Jr. goes from, a conversation in a room between two weird guys to pure like pictographs. Like it's just hieroglyphics after a while, and in a way that's just the visual games of the puns that are done. Again, it's like a kind of meaning and a kind of play with language, but it can only hold up so much. It evaporates, even though it's set down on the page, after a little while, and if anything, it becomes a reminder of how inadequate these things are sans context to convey a deeper meaning. In the exact same way that Stillman Sr., the thing that Quinn, sees him do every single day walking these circuits is not just leaving like these secret coded messages through his footsteps, but picking up broken objects. Is an umbrella that no longer has the actual umbrella attached. Can we still call that an umbrella? It's the ship of Theseus type thing, right? When does the essence, the quintessence, the Daniel quintessence of something change and evaporate?
Well, not just can we call it that, but like we have almost like an obligation not to call it the same thing, because to call it an umbrella still is to lie about like its true nature. Yeah. Because it's no longer an umbrella. Like to call it an umbrella is to sin against like the primordial language.
But if I was like talking to Stillman, I would say like, well, that's why we have modifiers, right? It's like that's why I say, oh, it's a broken umbrella. Like that's why those exist. And I'm sure he would probably disagree with me, but I was like thinking that whole time, I'm like, yeah, we could just affix more modifiers to something to like hopefully get it closer to what it should be, even though we're like never gonna get there. So.
But it's the never getting there. It doesn't matter how many modifiers you get. There should be a one-to-one, like perfect understanding, and there can't be, right? Like that's impossible. There's no way to restore a world in which we are perfectly able to communicate with one another. Again, that's the whole point of the Tower of Babel. That was it. God didn't like it. It's gone.
And I think there's also this implication that brokenness in particular is aberrant, that we wouldn't need that modifier in Eden then, because
Right.
there would be no need for it because essence and existence would be unified. Things couldn't break. There wouldn't be entropy, you know.
Yeah.
There's you know, that's what is different about that's what it means to be in a fallen world. Like things can change, things can need to be modified because they're not already intrinsically like in line with their essence and perfected.
Do you know that bit of that where Mark Maron talks about going to the Creationist Museum and seeing that, like, you know, before the fall, there were no weeds. And Mark Maron is like, okay, suddenly I see the guy who's the target of this. And this guy's like real tired of mowing his lawn. And he sees this and he goes, oh, damn, it was so much easier before the fall. So,
there were no lines at Costco before the fall. Gas was $1 a gallon. It was a simpler time.
You get immediately what you wanted.
Yeah, exactly. Another like, and this may, if for all I know, be in the novel. I didn't reread this part, but you know, getting to that idea that like our native intuition cannot arrive at a deeper meaning, or if it could, we couldn't then convey it to somebody else. I can't remember what spurs this, but Quinn goes to when he hears about Stillman Sr.'s books. That he was like this, big religious scholar, whatever. And he goes to the library. There are two names engraved above the library are Plato, which we only see like the last half of an A and then TO of, and then Aristotle. So he's moving away from a personally inward, self-reflective consideration of something to arrive at the forms or whatever, like the Platonic path that one goes on, to look out in the world around him and to arrive at truth by constructing it out of like the material, physical stuff in front of him, by being a detective, essentially. So it's just little stuff like that. It's just every single page, there's something like that. And, it's not super obtrusive, but for a book that's all about meaning and how hard it is to hold on to it, I think it is really rich with meaning and really densely layered in what it's trying to communicate to you.
Yeah, I especially like the 9-panel motif, because it's like, obviously it's 9 panels, but then like that image shows up as like both a jail cell door and like a window, and like there's like a lot of playing around with like what like 9 panels means that I think is super cool. Like it never just means like one thing. It always shows up somewhere else.
Yeah, Mazzucchelli uses it in incredibly creative ways. So like the 9-panel grid is a long time ago in the early days of comics, that was sort of like the default way of doing things. There was nothing fancy or technically sophisticated about it. It's like, well, this is an easy load-bearing structure for storytelling. Because it very naturally shows the progress of time, especially, and motion. And so if you're doing, say, Superman, it's easy to see him go from top left to bottom right and see all the stuff that he does in the meantime, saving the day. And then you could contrast it, say, with a big splash page of one huge action. Just that sort of narrative momentum you can build in structurally into your storytelling. After the book Watchmen came out in 1986, which relies exclusively on a 9-panel grid structure, and when it deviates very obtrusively away from that. So it's making a point when it moves away from it. It became kind of gentrified. It became this like a sign that you're making a serious comic when you do that. In a way that has maybe degraded over time, neither here nor there. I only bring it up to say that Mazzucchelli uses it as creatively, essentially, as Moore and Gibbons do in Watchmen, where, yes, it can be used to show a flow of time, but it also is used geometrically to essentially arrange meaning on a page, where on the top row will actually, a good example of this is early on, it takes 5 pages from when the phone starts ringing for Quinn to make it all the way over from his bed, like 5 steps, to pick up the phone and answer it and start like the big mystery. And then at a certain point, he when he's talking about why he loves mysteries and detective fiction, he says, I love the economy of storytelling where everything matters and things can, happen quickly. And in one panel, and I believe it might be the first time it deviates from 9 individual windows into 2 being combined. It's him getting back into bed. And what took 5 pages prior only takes a single panel now. And it's just playing with the sort of like syncopation of storytelling that way. And in other ways, there are times when, and maybe it's when he's poring over the Henry Dark stuff and like the theories of language or whatever. He's reading something he's very troubled by, regardless. And it's one image divided into 9 windows. It's but there's there still are the gutters between them, and it's him coming apart at the seams. Again, constant opportunities to play with how the narrative is presented when you have a base structure to either lean into or actively deviate from. And Mazzucchelli's, he's just the best. He's just the best to ever do it, I think.
I also really like the way that they do the scene where he's on the toilet and he has to finish like going on the toilet to then get up to do the phone. And like the panel takes its time as he like finishes wiping and then like gets back up. I also wanted to note, I feel like I don't know a lot of books that actively depict a character shitting, because in City of Glass, like Paul Auster even says expelling a turd, which is like actually one of those phrases you just don't see a lot of. And I think it's interesting that like Auster took a moment to put that in the story. And then, Mazzucchelli does it justice by like drawing out how long that takes to happen before he like picks up the phone, because he's like going to the bathroom while waiting for the mysterious person to call back in the beginning.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think of it like Mazzucchelli reading it and thinking, well, how am I going to depict this? Like what structure do I have to do? Because you can do anything, obviously. But that exact page, I remember I was rereading it this morning, but it just mentioned like on the first ring, he put down his book, which is a book about Marco Polo, again, linguistic games, saying Marco Polo just for purely the sign and signifier have totally, or the referent or whatever, have totally become dissonant. Where when we think of Marco Polo, you think of the pool game where you're saying it to find somebody. It's echolocation rather than talking about an Italian explorer. But anyway, first ring, he puts it down. Second ring, he looks up. Third ring, he shits. Fourth ring, he wipes. Fifth ring, he picks up the phone. And to have it delineated like that in the book, you're like, well, of course you do a 9-panel grid. Of course you would do something that divvies up action as deliberately as that does. And so, again, just very thoughtful storytelling from Mazzucchelli throughout before you even get to how sort of gripping the portraiture and other stuff is throughout. Yeah. It's a very emotionally moving book, I think, in the way it's put together without having to call too much attention to itself.
It's very understated. And there's just little things when you, as if, I've been flipping kind of through it as we've been chatting here, looking for images as we've been talking, and, just the ways, just the ways little details are done, the way different characters are drawn, while still maintaining like this very cohesive style. When he's visiting Auster, I think that something that's really interesting is Auster and his wife are drawn like slightly more realistically than every other character is, because having this kind of normal bourgeois family life to Quinn is this thing that like he can't have, and they're real people in a way that like even the other people he's interacting with are just characters in this mystery story that he's wrapped himself up in. Peter and Virginia are both drawn very strangely, but they're drawn in this very highly stylized manner. Like Peter is again like a ghost, and Virginia is like a femme fatale, and just they are archetypes in the same way that Quinn is kind of trying to embody an archetype, and he's drawn with this very like simple cartoony style. His face is like just an oval without kind of any hard edges on it, and I just think that it's the little things like that really are so rewarding about going through this book as you keep going.
No, definitely. I mean, when he's visiting Auster, there's we very rarely see things like completely from his POV.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that.
For our protagonist, and there's one panel where it switches to like just from his head looking out, sitting in the chair. You see his body looking out the rest of the living room, and it's so disorienting and dislocating. And you're like, this guy does not feel at home here. Like this is. and it's depicted like maybe with slightly more detail than the rest of the book is. But I think that's a very astute and correct point. Like Scott McCloud makes this point in understanding comics, and I think it's a point well taken. But the more specific someone gets, the less they belong to the reader. As the more specific that they're illustrated, I should say. Yeah. Where like if someone is just again a hieroglyphic essentially, well they can look like anything, and your imagination fills in the gaps. The burden of authorship is placed more heavily on you. Whereas if someone is very keenly detailed, well, you're just looking at what the author's giving. You're looking at what the illustrator is providing for you. They're, dotting the I's and crossing the T's and everything. And so essentially this is a character who is an author having that experience where like, I am not in control. I am not structuring what this narrative is going to be anymore. And of course it precipitates the breakdown.
Well, speaking of the breakdown, do we want to kind of keep moving along with the plot a little bit? I definitely,
we probably should.
So again, in terms of the plot as it is, so we have our friend Mr. Quinn, and he has just had this pretty heart-wrenching experience interacting with this kind of doppelganger child of his own son. And he realizes, so he has made a promise to his client, Virginia. He kind of admits to her that he's really hit a dead end of the case, but she's, kind of worried like, oh, this is like the day that Stillman Sr.'s like said in this letter that he's going to kill his son. And Quinn says, like, I'll make sure to call you like every 2 hours to check in and make sure things are okay as I like keep trying to crack this. And he ends up at Oster's house and he loses track of time. And he realizes like, oh shit, I forgot to call. Like, so he runs to like the nearest payphone. He tries to call and there's no answer on the other end. And he keeps trying to call and keeps trying to call and keeps trying to call and keeps just getting dead air. And eventually he ends up back outside of their apartment building, and he just, ends up having this total breakdown. And he just sits there like watching the apartment for what's implied to be weeks on end. Yeah. Months even. Yeah.
Vigilance is of the utmost importance. And he loses himself totally in like the reverie of this past that he's set for himself. Because he doesn't get dead air when he calls, he gets a busy signal. Right. And that he latches onto that. He's like, that busy signal means something. It has to mean something. All of this has to mean something. And if I just sit here and observe, then that meaning will come to fruition. I'll arrive at it, and this will all be redeemed in some way. All this time spent, all this, energy and emotion spent.
And I think also there's this element where it's like, this is his chance to right what went wrong originally in a weird way, because I think the implication is kind of that Virginia has, again, she's kissed him, like she's kind of implicated that there is some kind of, I don't even want to say like potential relationship here, but her kind of weird mixed signals have like clearly put in his head that there's some kind of chance here. And then Stillman Jr. as kind of this abused child, even though he is an adult man at this point, there's this implication that if he can save them from the bad father, I think that it's kind of, again, it's this writing of the what has gone wrong in his life. That by not being able, he wants to do this because it's this chance to save a woman and in his mind, kind of this child man from this chaotic, world.
I also think it's interesting that before he does that too, he spends a lot of time describing various people experiencing homelessness And then when he's deciding to watch the house for months on end, he essentially becomes a homeless person. And I think like in this act of like describing something and then committing to it so intensely, he sort of like becomes that as well. So it's like he becomes Mac's work, then he becomes Stillman Sr., and then he finally becomes somebody he described as well. In terms of just like if you pay attention to something enough, I think like Auster seems to be suggesting that you become that in some extent, and then Daniel Quinn just takes it like further.
Yeah, certainly if you have like no still center of self to return to, which he doesn't, obviously, he has that triad of selves, and that only could persist or obtain in his little hermetically sealed apartment, which he's been forced to leave as part of this quest. So yeah, that's absolutely right. Like whoever he's around, whoever he hails, whatever, he's writing the whole time. As he writes, he becomes that person. And so he very much becomes Stillman Sr., looking for meaning in these like cast off, meaningless objects. I'm trying to think. No, sorry. There's a way that ties together, but I'm losing my thread. I'd have to go back in my way too many notes on it. But yeah, like that's the important thing is that, yeah, he's losing himself. And so he writes very evocatively and you know, in a very like almost like gonzo journalist, like I'm here, man, sort of style, talking about like the homeless people that he sees and how like there's like an aristocracy of them. There's you know, people who are genuinely extremely talented and like wonderful performers. And there are people who are like working hard and are just like, I'm just temporarily in this, man. I'm getting out of this. Sorry about my dogs, guys. I think our mail is here. This is
it's okay.
Yeah.
There's always an issue, but anyway, but yeah, so he's observing all of them, and even as he does that, he's trying to apply meaning. Where like there's some people where, of course, like I get why they do what they do. Like they're making a living or they're like on a path out of this sort of abject existence. And then there are others who are plainly mad, as he sees it. You know, like a guy who just bangs on a trash can with drumsticks tunelessly, endlessly, and he thinks that if he stops, then the city will be destroyed. Like there's some obsession that compels this behavior, which is of course exactly what's going on with him. And it's
Mazzucchelli even points that out too, because he's tapping on the glass when he decides to like keep doing it. So yeah, like Mazzucchelli even underlines that connection too. So
yeah, absolutely. And that spiral into madness, because things get very abstract around this time. Like the things were sort of presented in negative, where things had largely been white space, occasionally you know, filled by black ink. This is predominantly black with a little white on it, sort of like a woodcut in the way that it's presented. And at a certain point, you know, it's just he sees like a jazz musician or a clarinetist. That's with like monkeys dancing around him or whatever. Yeah, and that abstracts from a guy, you know, playing the clarinet to a guy encircled by musical notes, to that image of the guy encircled by musical notes on an LP, on a record spinning on something, to just a couple of blobs of white in vinyl blackness. And then he clicks his pen and it dispels the whole reverie that he's in. And I'm out. You know, it's like unplugging in the Matrix or whatever. But it's just not that easy because he can't stop writing. He can't stop leaning on these words to, again, make some sense of whatever the fuck is going on in his life.
Yeah, this is the point where writing becomes like more like, obviously he's been writing. He was writing before the story starts. He's been writing throughout the story. Crucially, like writing by hand. When he first takes the case and so is sort of trying to organize his thoughts, he buys a notebook and is writing by hand in it. And at this point, like whatever he was doing before, like he's no longer in control of himself, if he ever was.
Yeah, and it just continues to spiral. I mean, he isn't like a homeless person. He becomes a homeless person.
Yeah. I mean, there's the great scene where he tries to go back to his apartment when he kind of has this brief moment of, what am I doing? Like he sees himself in the mirror and he sees he has like he's grown like this like long shaggy beard and he looks like garbage and he's like,
but there's no sense that something is wrong or that this is bad or good. It just is.
Yeah, he's just changed. Yeah. But he tries to go back to
free floating.
He tries to go back to the apartment, and the apartment has been, because he's been gone for months, he's been evicted, and a woman has moved in, and the woman looks kind of like the woman that he was reading his book on the train earlier in the story. Mm-hmm. And he can't tell though, which I think is interesting from the standpoint that, again, we're talking about like meaning and whether things have meaning and whether things are being orchestrated by some kind of higher power. And it's like he's at the point where he can't even tell anymore. Like, maybe there's meaning here, but he's reached a point where he couldn't even actually discern meaning if it was staring him in the face.
I mean, the best that he can do is be like, well, a better detective would have asked these questions, you know, and so he ends up getting in touch with Oster again, because he actually does that because Oster was going to cash the check that had his name on it, that the Stillmans had given him $500 so that he can, so that Quinn can maintain his vigil outside their apartment. And when he calls, he's like, where the fuck have you been? I've been trying to get in touch with you. The check bounced. Presumably, the Stillmans either never existed or don't have that money. And Peter Stillman Sr. had committed suicide. The guy that you were supposed to look out for died 2 months ago. He jumped off the bridge and died before he ever hit the water. And so if this, quest ever had purpose, if any of this was ever real, it's certainly not anymore. It gets very like Neon Genesis Evangelion, like very abstract in the way that it all sort of comes tumbling down, as they say on Evangelion. But he goes to the Stillman's apartment after he's visited his own. It's like, oh, well, it's not my home anymore. All the pictures of my family, they're gone. Everything that I, identified this as a place that I inhabited, all gone. It's vanished into air like the meanings of words. And so he goes to where the Stillmans lived. The front door of the apartment building is open. The door of their particular apartment is open. I don't know really what to take from that, but it means something to him.
Yeah, I have a thought about that too. But if you want to keep going,
I was just to wrap it up, just to say basically, like, he goes, and much as he did at the very beginning of the comic, he strips nude and throws his clothes out the window and lays on the floor and writes whenever it's light, whenever it's dark. He sleeps. The way he perceives light at a certain point, he said, I only have time to write, a sentence or two before it's dark again. And so he's clearly like losing consciousness or losing his mind or whatever. And starts to consider, hey, maybe, what if I spoke these things instead of wrote them? What if just by saying it, even though it evaporates, it still might have some sort of meaning? What if I remembered all the things that mattered in my life? What if I remembered the people that I loved and immortalize them in some, in this passing way? And then he devolves further and further and literally sinks into the written page as he's exploring these ideas. And the book's over. The last thing that we get is some unnamed narrator, the person who's been following all this, again, possibly the superego William Wilson, saying like, well, we never got any answers on that. And it's too bad, and I think Paul Auster was a real shithead in the way that he behaved, but here we go. That's the end. And it's, it's a sort of nebulous conclusion to all of it after a very, I think, emotionally moving ending to Quinn's story before that. Sort of like Psycho in that way, very like an anticlimax.
I do think too, though, and like, because at some point Stillman Sr. talks about like, if we restore, God's proper language, we can all enter the Tower of Babel. There will be a room for all of us, and then we will forget everything we knew, which I think is like kind of what happens to Quinn, because he tries to remember, but like in writing down everything, it's once he writes it all down or speaks it, it disappears. And so then like the character is like literally undone. And then, then it just like, and all we have record of it is like the Red Notebook, which interestingly in the New York trilogy, like the Red Notebook comes back again in the last story in the locked room. But like, I don't know how thematic it is, but it's definitely something he likes. Auster, the author, likes putting back in. Like one character gives another character a red notebook. But yeah, like, so then at the actual end of City of Glass, the William Wilson, I think, gets a hold of the notebook, right? Like, I think, doesn't Auster like give it to him, like Auster in the story?
Yes. Auster's the one who calls, the narrator, not necessarily William Wilson, but calls him and is like, hey, you got to come with me. I found out where he is.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
And the guy's like, the narrator's like, I didn't really want to go, but I'm like, all right, I'll go. And he gave me the notebook, and he clearly, was very troubled by the way it all shook out. But that's no excuse. Essentially, is the underlying
right.
No excuse for the way he treated him. But yeah, I think that's a point very well made about the Tower of Babel, and like, yeah, he's entering his empty chamber, his cell. He's going Casper Hauser mode, and I think very touchingly, his conclusion is not to devolve into total like nihilism or madness, but rather to think about what did matter in his life and arrive at a way of reconstructing meaning right before the very end. So not like a hopeful conclusion necessarily, but let's just say, throwing it out there, that the narrator is William Wilson. The narrator is our protagonist we've been following this whole time, just a different personality within him or different voice within him. Now that the story of Quinn has been resolved and been subsumed back into the person that's been bearing it, now maybe the superego is more present. The superego has more agency. And in a way, this has all been resolved because he did finally arrive at some sense of meaning in the end. Again, maybe just way too pat of an explanation, but it's just one way to read it, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, I do think Auster, the author, has a sort of like symmetry to a lot of his stuff, like in a way that I think you could, I buy that reading in terms of like, I feel like he doesn't particularly like unexplained stuff, at least in this book that I've read of his, where like everything is kind of counterbalanced. And like in other stuff in the New York trilogy, there's like a similar like counterbalancing where like one character becomes another character and then they like resolve kind of. It reminds me a lot of like balancing math equations, but like obviously in like a better, like a artistic way, not just like a coldly rational way. There's something kind of like nice to see everything like way out, I guess.
Yeah, there's a way of doing this that would just be like a Christopher Nolan movie, and it's like a stoichiometry problem or whatever. And I think this is and again, in the way that it's told, like that's what symmetry is exactly the right word for what an iron panel grid can do. It can create a symmetrical visual tableau and then cut against the grain whenever it needs to. And so the differences are when you start to notice things. And so, of course, exactly the sort of approach you want to take to adapting Paul Auster.
What did you guys think of the title? Because I have an idea about what the title means, but I'm not entirely certain.
An idea I will venture is just that the only time that glass is a really meaningful visual motif in the story is when we see a thumbprint smudge on the window of Quinn's apartment. We see it very early on. And this is one of the first times that Mazzucchelli plays games with this sort of like pictograph storytelling, where it zooms into the thumbprint. The thumbprint then becomes sort of abstracted, becomes abstracted again, and becomes kind of the shape of a brain broadly. And then that shape of the brain becomes a maze, and the maze becomes a labyrinth that Quinn is within. And so I think just as easily that thumbprint smudge can be wiped off and clean. And the world outside can be rendered real by going on into it and abandoning these fantasies, or can remain even more distorted as it is at one point when he's looking out the window and the city becomes a maze. Like constantly, that's what he's sort of being trapped in. and it's also, through a mirror darkly through a lens of perception. Glass distorts, it changes, it doesn't necessarily give us an accurate picture, or rather it creates it reinforces a subjective analysis of or interpretation of what's going on around us. Again, an essential division between us and the truth between us and each other. And so certainly in the context of this graphic novel, I think that's what City of Glass could mean.
Yeah.
That's my take on it.
I found that it was the intro that I guess Spiegelman wrote referenced the Waldo Emerson quote where it's like, commit a crime and the earth is made of glass, which like I guess has to do with like your conscience, or like the fact that if you commit a crime, you'll think everyone can see you and you can see everyone else. But like to me that doesn't exactly jive with the story, although I like that it got brought up in the context of like crime fiction. But I do think, to me, at least, City of Glass is like supposed to be what happened if we had like, the Edenic language where we would see everyone, we could communicate clearly, and there would be like nothing to hide. Like it would be like, there would be no need for privacy because we all understood each other immediately. So it's like sort of like the thing that doesn't exactly exist to me, or like that maybe like, some people want to, like, for instance, the Stillman Sr. wants it to exist. But yeah, I like that Auster gives it a weird title because I feel like it offsets everything really nicely. And he kind of does that in some of the other stuff in the book itself, the New York trilogy. But I liked your reading too. I feel like it is like the glass is the thing that comes between us in some ways. Like that's the barrier or something.
Well, it's also a synecdoche, right? Because it's part standing for the whole. It's I will create my own New York City inside the pages of this book, knowing, much like someone say rewriting the Quixote, that it will never be exactly what goes on the outside. I know that there is a Borges story about this exact thing. Maybe it's Italo Calvino, where I think it is Calvino, because this is where the term the desert of the real comes from.
The map. Yeah, exactly. That's Borges. Yeah, it's on exactitude in science. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, that idea, and this certainly comes up again. It's like, well, can I really have a map of something if certain details are elided? Can I have a map of something if not every single element of it is there? And in the story, every single element of it is there. The map becomes as real as the world, or perhaps more real than the world. What remains is the desert of the real, that is inferior to the copy that has been made. In City of Glass, obviously the same thing can't be done, but this is somebody that I think is a very powerful and recurring motif throughout it, where it's like Quinn takes, when he's watching Stillman Sr., he takes note of every single thing that he does. He tries to create these maps out of all of his behavior. Stillman collects every single broken object he finds. It's maybe I can create the big picture if I focus on every single minute detail. It will finally add up to something meaningful. Of course that can't be. It can never be.
Right.
But like it rather than City of Glass, maybe it's like City in Glass. And
I was going to say, I think something that's interesting is also like glass is something that is delicate, and like this is a book about brokenness and about things. What do you do when something is broken? Like, is it the same thing? I think, I don't know that the title necessarily implies that the City of Glass is broken, but it is something that could break. And I think that that's kind of what happens at the end is Daniel Quinn's world fully breaks. Maybe it was delicate before, and now it is fully broken. And, he is this shattered person to some degree, and his perception of the world has been shattered. Which, I think that it's a great title from the standpoint that I think there are so many different levels you can read it all. When you first suggested this, Walt, like I looked up the title and I was like, it's part of something called the New York trilogy. And at first I kind of groaned a little bit because I was like, oh, it's called that because it's New York City. And it's, oh, the city with all the skyscrapers.
Greatest city in the world, baby. Only in New York can you reconstruct God's language. Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of, having read it now and talking through it with you guys, I think that it's really a wonderful title,
Yeah.
Really, really captures so many different things. And
I do want to say,
we're looking into a prism, I guess.
Yeah. I want to say thank you guys, because I'd read the graphic novel within the last couple of years, and it immediately became a favorite. But I hadn't revisited it, and I certainly hadn't done like the kind of close read that I had to do for preparation for this show. And I really got a ton out of it. It just makes the text that much richer, like whether or not these are things that Auster intended, and also rest in peace, Paul Auster, or that Mazzucchelli intended, or Karasik. I think there's so many different little resonances throughout, and it's just it's a delight to go through. Like I love my superhero comics, but they don't always rise to the level of intricacy and thematic depth that this does. So it's been a real treat.
Well, one more thing, and then we can close up. I think that's.
I'm not wrapping up. I just wanted to make that.
Well, we're getting. I know you said you had 5, and we're getting close. But there is an element here where I think this story is playing around a little bit with kind of super heroic ideas in terms of, again, I keep coming back to, and it's something that I almost wish the story had played around with a little bit more. Mac's work kind of exits as a presence pretty quickly once Quinn kind of decides to try to inhabit the detective role. And I think that, obviously the again, especially you coming from Batman, Batman is a noir detective and a superhero, at the same time. I think that I kept coming back to this idea of like Quinn is trying to inhabit this heroic archetype and failing because, as much as we wish that we could just step into these roles and kind of be completed by them, like that doesn't work. And I think, that's, I think where Quixote comes into it as well. It's this person who does do that and succeeds and then dies having completely completed his desired quest to be the knight errant. I don't have like exactly a deeper point there, but I do feel like the archetypical kind of stuff going on in this book is also really interesting, and kind of the way that detectives and heroic characters kind of fill our psyches, and the way we kind of can try to step into those roles, I think is something this book is playing around with.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that, like, sort of to your point, I think that, Batman would have solved this. He would have realized he was in the book in no time, right? World's greatest detective. But no, to your point, like we hold on to these things as archetypes as a sort of, the reason why, if you want to use the term, that there's sort of this modern folklore or myth, is that this is an example of heroic action, an example of resilience. Which is true, like dating back in America anyway, to like the frontier hero, Natty Bumppo or whatever, that evolves into the private detective, which then evolves into superheroes. It's all one part of like a grand romantic, capital R romantic tradition. And the sort of like the fallacy of that, the romance of that, is that can be applied or can withstand real life. And that's only true if you admit a certain level of delusion. And so when he comes into contact with reality, he can't be Mac's work anymore. Like, it's only at a distance, only at the remove from the comfort of his apartment that any of this can obtain. And so he reaches out to Paul Auster, who might be a detective, and Paul Auster is just a guy. He's he also doesn't have the answers. There's no one stepping in to solve these things. But by that same token, Stillman Sr., this, almost like demiurgic figure or whatever, is just a feeble old man who commits suicide halfway through the book anticlimactically. There's no, the femme fatale doesn't have a secret scheme going on, but neither is she going to satiate Quinn's desires. The genre will not hold. It can't. And I do think it's interesting. Yeah, Mac's work is just done away with. Like literally, it's just like we see his gravestone at the very end. It's like, he's gone. It's simple as that, and it's always like this kind of delicate dance of to what degree can the fantasy persist, and to what degree does it have to collapse on contact with reality.
Yeah.
But yeah, Batman would have taken care of this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In a heartbeat. I mean, if anybody could decipher the Adamic language, it's the world's greatest detective.
Absolutely.
Get the
I like the idea
on it.
That like Batman would have also been like read up on the scholarship. He'd be like, Stillman's read of Milton, not good. We don't like it.
Yeah. Exactly. Very facile. Like he focuses on like 3 words. I mean, that is what I like to imagine, is that he will read or listen to or watch literally anything he needs to do to help him solve a case. So like, he would read Paradise Lost and all the JSTOR articles around it, whatever.
In one night.
For sure. Yeah, he's a big speed reader for sure.
Do either of you have anything else you want to say about City of Glass? I feel like that was kind of my last point.
I think we covered it. I was saving the City of Glass title question for the end, so I've exhausted my topic list. I feel like so.
I think I have. I mean, obviously, you guys know you've listened to my show. I can ramble for much longer, but I have exhausted my list of topics too. So I'm ready to wrap up.
I don't want to force you to start delving into the 10 pages of notes to look at something.
You really don't.
All right.
You really don't.
Do we want to do plugs? You got any plugs, Walt?
Well, I have a show called The Black Casebook. I don't know when this episode is going to come out, but hopefully, if it's within the next 2 weeks, I will have my next episode out on the book Dark Knight, Dark City by Peter Milligan and Kieran Dwyer, which is a great. It's the first story to really posit the idea that Gotham City is haunted somehow. That Gotham City might actually be cursed in some way. That it is the real nemesis of Batman. And lots and lots of interesting ideas about urban malaise and about sort of the weight of history are all part of that. And I think it's going to be a really fun episode. I'm looking forward to finally having it done for sure. Keep an eye out for that. And just in general, The Black Casebook. That's I'm on Twitter. I'm allegedly on Instagram and Blue Sky at Black Casebook on those. Or at Black Casebook Pod, blackcasebookpod@gmail.com. You feel free to write me if you want to say, hey, you don't understand Paul Auster at all. That's fine. But yeah, those are the places you can find me. I occasionally I guest on the Marvelous or the Death of Cinema podcast as well, which I'll put a plug in for them that they don't need. But yeah, that's it for me, guys.
Awesome. Well, Walt, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a total blast. I'm sure love to have you on again in the future if you would have another non-Batman comic you'd like to talk about at some point. You're always welcome.
Fellas.
Yeah.
Anytime.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right. Well,
cool.
Until then, bookheads, Semper Books.
Semper Books. Yeah.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.